I want you to picture a boardroom. Not a small one. A proper executive boardroom on the 14th floor of a glass office tower in downtown Cincinnati. The kind of room where the table alone costs more than most people's first car, where the chairs have a specific engineered weight to them that communicates importance before a single word is spoken. Picture 42 people seated around that table and along the walls, most of them senior directors or above, and picture me standing at the head of it, in a navy blue suit that I'd had tailored 18 months ago, presenting third-quarter projections to the regional leadership team. Now picture me, right in the middle of that presentation, mid-sentence, mid-slide, mid-thought, catching my own reflection in the darkened window behind the projector screen. And picture the strangest thing happening. Not a breakdown. Not a panic attack. Not anything that anyone else in the room could have seen or would have noticed. Just a pause, so small it registered as a breath, in which I looked at my reflection in that window and thought, with a clarity that had absolutely no business being in that room at that moment, that isn't me. Not that man. Not that suit. Not that performance of certainty and authority and crisp forward momentum. Something underneath all of that was sitting very quietly, looking back at me through the glass, and it had been waiting, I realized in that one suspended second, for a very long time. I finished the presentation. I answered the questions. I shook hands and nodded at the right moments and said the things that get said in rooms like that. I drove home at 6:15 in the October dark. And when I walked in the front door of the house I shared with my wife Jennifer, I stood in the hallway for a full minute with my coat still on, thinking about that reflection. What I was thinking about was a cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And a weekend, for months earlier, that started as my wife's fun idea and ended as the most disorienting, most clarifying, most irreversible thing that had ever happened to me.
Let me tell you about it.
All of it. Because if I'm going to tell it at all, I'm going to tell it the way it actually was, not the polished version, not the version where everything makes sense in hindsight and all the feelings are tidy and properly labeled. The real version, which is messier and stranger and, in the end, more honest than anything I said in that boardroom. My name is Ryan Calloway. I'm 38 years old, and for approximately 35 of those years I have been, by all observable measures, the most consistent version of myself imaginable. I don't mean this as a boast. I mean it as a fact, one I've reflected on enough to understand that consistency, in my case, was not entirely a virtue. I grew up in a small city in eastern Ohio, the only son of Frank Calloway, who worked in manufacturing management and believed, with the conviction of a man who had never seriously questioned his own beliefs, that there was a correct way to be a man and that deviation from it was weakness. Frank was not cruel. I want to be precise about this, because precision matters when you're describing someone who shaped you significantly. He was not cruel. He was simply absolute. The world, in Frank's framework, was organized into things that were strong and things that were soft, and strong was good and soft was a problem to be corrected. I absorbed this framework the way children absorb everything their parents teach them without being explicitly taught, through atmosphere, through the specific shape of approval and disapproval, through understanding very early which version of me got a nod and which version got a look. I was naturally a fairly sensitive child, curious, emotionally perceptive, the kind of kid who noticed things and felt things and had opinions about colors and textures and how rooms were arranged. None of this fit the framework. So I built, gradually and efficiently, a version of myself that did fit it. Ryan Calloway, focused, capable, unemotional, direct, ambitious in the clean, forward-moving way that workplaces and fathers reward without complication. By the time I finished my MBA at 26 and took my first corporate job, the built version had become indistinguishable from the original. I genuinely couldn't have told you where one ended and the other began. That's how complete the architecture was. I wasn't performing anything, as far as I could tell. I was just Ryan. Straightforward, high-performing, professionally excellent Ryan, who wore his suits like a second skin and never once lingered in front of a mirror thinking about his reflection. I met Jennifer Walsh at a gallery opening that I attended because a colleague had dragged me there, and I went because I'd learned that going to things, even things outside my natural habitat, was the kind of social capital that compounded over time. She was standing in front of a large abstract canvas that I had privately decided was absurd, holding a glass of wine and saying something to the friend beside her that I couldn't hear but that made her friend laugh so hard she spilled some of her drink. Jennifer was wearing a yellow dress that seemed to belong to no particular decade, her dark hair pinned up in a way that looked like it had taken either 5 seconds or 45 minutes, and I genuinely couldn't tell which. And she turned around when my colleague made the introductions with the direct, undecorated attention of a person who had decided to actually show up to wherever they were. She looked at me, then at the canvas, then back at me.
"What do you think of it?" she said.
"Honestly?" I said. "Always," she said. "I think it's trying too hard," I said. She considered this for a moment. "I think you're wrong," she said, "but I respect the conviction." And that was, essentially, the beginning of the 10 years that followed. Jennifer is a graphic designer who runs her own small studio, works with about 15 clients at any given time, and operates on a creative and emotional frequency that is entirely unlike mine. She is spontaneous in a way that is deliberate rather than impulsive. She had thought about the yellow dress, it turned out, but she thought about it for 30 seconds rather than 30 minutes, and she had this way of making decisions quickly based on what felt right that I found alternately fascinating and unsettling for the first 3 years we were together. She felt everything fully. She said what she meant without building a case for it first. She laughed loudly and cried at things on television, and once spent an entire Saturday afternoon rearranging the living room furniture because the energy in the room felt wrong, and when she was finished it did, I had to admit, feel better, though I couldn't have explained why. We worked because of the contrast, and in spite of it, she pulled me toward things I would have walked past. I brought a kind of structure to our shared life that she appreciated more than she always admitted. We had been trying to have children for 3 years, which had added its own layer of strain and tenderness to everything, and which had, I think, made us both more aware of the things we carried privately and had not yet found the language to share. It was Jennifer who planned the cabin weekend. She'd been talking about it for months, a long weekend completely unplugged, no laptop, no work email, no conference calls, just 4 days in the mountains in early June before my third quarter preparation season made disappearing impossible. She found a cabin in North Carolina, 3 hours from Cincinnati, up in the Blue Ridge where the elevation meant the nights were still cool even in June, and the mornings came in with a mountain fog that she described, when she showed me the photos online, as exactly what both of our nervous systems need. I agreed to go. Not without internal negotiation. I had a report that needed finishing, a call I had to reschedule, the pervasive background anxiety of a person who has built an identity on being indispensable and therefore finds extended absence from work genuinely difficult in the physiological sense. But Jennifer had a way of presenting things that made resistance feel smaller than it was, and the truth was that I was tired. Not tired in the way that a long sleep fixes. Tired in a deeper way, a structural way, the kind of tired that comes from performing the same version of yourself for 35 consecutive years without a break. We drove up on a Friday afternoon, the highway giving way to progressively smaller roads until we were on a gravel track through a stand of old hemlocks, and the cabin materialized out of the trees, a genuine log structure, compact and warm-looking, with a porch that faced west toward a view of ridgelines layered in blue haze. Jennifer had been quiet for most of the drive in the particular way she was quiet when she was thinking carefully about something she was going to say soon. I had noticed this but hadn't pressed it. I'd learned over 10 years that pressing Jennifer before she was ready produced nothing useful. We unpacked the car. She had brought significantly more bags than I had, which wasn't unusual. Jennifer traveled with what she called essentials, which encompassed a range of items that I had never successfully predicted in advance. I brought my one bag, my toiletries, the novel I'd been failing to get through for 3 months, and a deliberate absence of my laptop, which had required a conscious act of will on my part that I was oddly proud of. We made dinner together that first evening, pasta from ingredients she'd packed, wine that she'd chosen, music from her phone on a portable speaker that she set on the porch railing, so it drifted inside. The cabin had a wood stove, and she lit it even though it wasn't strictly cold enough because she said it changed the quality of the light.
She was right. It did.
After dinner, we sat on the porch with our wine and watched the last of the light go out over the ridgelines, and I felt something that I am always slightly unprepared for, even after 10 years, the specific sensation of actually relaxing. Not the managed, scheduled relaxation of a person who has blocked time in their calendar for it, but the real thing, which sneaks up on you when you're not looking and announces itself as a kind of softening behind the sternum, a slight lowering of something that's been held up for too long. You look different, Jennifer said. Different how? Like your face remembered what it looks like when it's not working, she said. It's a good look on you. I laughed at that. She topped up my wine. We talked for a long time, the easy-flowing kind of conversation that good marriages are largely made of, the accumulated shorthand of a decade together, references and callbacks, and the kind of honesty that comes when you're away from your regular context, and the usual defenses feel temporarily unnecessary. She told me about a client who was driving her quietly insane, and I told her about the internal politics around the third quarter restructuring, and neither of us was particularly interested in our own professional problems, and both of us were more interested in the other person's, which has always been one of the quiet foundations of us. Somewhere around 10 o'clock, she said, I have an idea for tomorrow. That sentence. I have an idea for tomorrow. I have turned it over in my mind so many times since that it's become almost abstract, like a word you repeat until it loses its meaning. Because what it preceded was not a suggestion about a hiking trail or a local restaurant she wanted to try. What it preceded was a weekend that rearranged me from the inside out. What kind of idea? I asked. She pulled her feet up onto the porch chair, hugging her knees, looking at the dark tree line rather than at me. A planning gesture, I recognized. Jennifer looked away from you when she was assembling something she wanted to say exactly right. You know how we've been talking about how tired you are, she said. Not just this week, in general.
For a while.
The kind of tired that doesn't go away with sleep. I know the kind of tired, I said. I've been thinking about why that is, she said. And I have a theory that I want to test. She turned and looked at me then. Her expression was very direct and very careful at the same time, which was a combination she only had when she was about to say something she'd been holding for a long time. I think part of you is exhausted from carrying Ryan around all the time. I looked at her. Ryan is me, I said.
I know, she said.
That's the thing. That's the exhausting part. When you're both the person and the performance of the person at the same time, all day, every day, for years, it's a lot. She paused. I want to try something tomorrow. Just here, just us. And I want you to say yes before I tell you what it is, because if I tell you first, you'll build a case against it before you've even felt it. I looked at her for a long moment. The fire inside was doing something warm to the light through the cabin windows. The wine was exactly right. Jennifer was watching me with that patient certainty she had when she knew something about me that I hadn't gotten to yet. That's a significant ask, I said. I know. Ask me something else first. Something small. Build trust. She laughed. Ryan. I'm negotiating.
You're stalling, she said.
Which means some part of you already knows you're going to say yes.
She was annoyingly right about that.
I said yes. She went inside before I did that night. I sat on the porch alone for a while, watching the stars, which were extraordinary up there, away from city light, the kind of sky that makes you feel the accurate scale of things, and I thought about what she'd said. Carrying Ryan around. I rolled the phrase around in my mind and felt it land in an uncomfortable place, the way true things that you're not ready to fully look at land somewhere just outside your peripheral vision and stay there until you turn your head. I slept well in the mountain air. Better than I'd slept in months. In the morning, Jennifer was already up when I came into the kitchen. Coffee made, the mountain fog still thick outside the windows so that the world beyond the cabin was just gray-white suggestion. She handed me a mug, and she was vibrating with a particular contained energy that I associated with her best creative days, the days in her studio when she was in the middle of something that was going right. She put a bowl of oatmeal in front of me and sat across the table and looked at me with the air of someone who was about to enjoy themselves considerably. Ready, she said. No, I said. Perfect, she said. Honest answer. We're already doing well. She disappeared into the bedroom. I ate my oatmeal. I heard what sounded like bags being moved around, drawers opening, the specific sounds of Jennifer organizing something with the efficient enthusiasm she brought to projects she'd been planning for a while. She came out carrying a large tote bag, a garment bag draped over one arm, and a smaller bag that clinked slightly when she moved. She set them on the couch and turned to me with the expression of someone presenting a proposal they're confident about. "Here's the idea," she said. "This weekend, for the rest of today and tomorrow, we're going to swap." She held up a hand before I could speak. "Not permanently. Not symbolically. Just as an experiment. I am going to be Ryan. Structured, decisive, plans everything Ryan. And you," she gestured at the bags, "are going to be someone else entirely." I looked at the bags. "What's in those?" I asked. "Things I've been collecting for about 3 months," she said. "Don't panic, Jennifer." "Ryan." She said my name the way I sometimes said hers, which landed as it was intended to. "You said yes last night. I'm holding you to it." I said yes before I knew what it was.
"That was the point," she said.
"Because if you'd known what it was, you would have listed 17 reasons why it was unnecessary, and we would have spent the weekend doing something perfectly nice that didn't actually change anything." She came and sat next to me on the couch, close, the way she sat when she was being serious under the lightness. "I have been watching you disappear into that suit for years. Into that version of yourself that your father approved of and your company rewards, and that I think costs you something real, Ryan, something I can see the cost of even when you can't. And I am asking you here, in this cabin, away from everything that monitors and measures you, to just try something different for 48 hours. That's all. 48 hours. I sat with that for a moment. Outside, the fog was beginning to thin, and the shape of the nearest ridge was emerging through it. Here's what I was actually feeling, in the interest of the honesty I promised at the beginning. I was not primarily resistant. I was primarily afraid. And I was afraid in a way that had a very specific shape, the shape of something that had been sitting quietly in the back of my chest for a very long time, and was now, in this mountain cabin with my wife and her carefully prepared bags, being pointed at directly for the first time. Something I had never given a name to. Something that Frank Calloway's framework had filed under inadmissible before I was old enough to object. "What exactly," I said, very carefully, "is in those bags?" She opened the garment bag first. Inside was a soft, flowing midi dress, dark teal, the kind of fabric that moved in the air when she held it up. Simple and elegant without being theatrical. No glitter, no Ostam drama. Just a genuinely beautiful piece of clothing. "I spent a lot of time on this," she said. "I know your proportions. I know what colors actually work on you."
"This isn't a joke, Ryan."
"It's not a prank. It's me trying to give you something real." I looked at the dress. The teal against the morning light in the cabin window. "And the other bags?" I said. She showed me the rest. A pair of soft flat shoes in my size. A simple cardigan in cream. A set of minimal silver jewelry. The smaller bag that had clinked held a few basic items. A light foundation. A lip tint. Nothing dramatic. And finally, at the bottom of the tote, a small handwritten card that said, in Jennifer's handwriting, "Her name is Riley. She likes mountains and coffee and doesn't apologize for taking up space." I read the card twice. "Riley," I said. "If you want it," Jennifer said. "Or you can choose your own." But I had a feeling Riley fit. I put the card down on the coffee table. I looked at the dress. I looked at my wife, who was watching me with an expression I could only describe as very gentle and very certain at the same time. "This is insane," I said. "Probably," she said. "You planned this for 3 months." "Closer to 4," she said, without apology. I sat there for a long moment in the morning quiet of the mountain cabin. The fire from last night had gone cold. The coffee in my mug was perfect. Outside, the fog was lifting in slow sections, revealing the actual world underneath. "If I do this," I said, "and I'm not saying I am." "Of course," she said. "If I do this, I need it to be understood that we don't talk about it when we get home. It stays here." "Agreed," she said immediately. "And if at any point I want to stop." "You stop," she said. "No questions, no pressure, no discussion. You stop." I nodded. A single, decisive nod, the kind I gave in boardrooms when a decision had been made. which was, I realized, slightly absurd given what the decision was. Okay, I said. Jennifer smiled. Not triumphantly, that's important. She didn't look like she'd won something. She looked like she was about to give me something she'd been holding carefully for a long time and was relieved to finally hand over. I took the garment bag and the shoes into the bedroom and closed the door behind me. The bedroom in the cabin was small and wood-paneled, with a window that looked directly into the hemlocks at such close range that the branches nearly touched the glass. I laid the dress on the bed and stood looking at it for a moment. The teal fabric had a subtle texture to it, a slight weight that you could see in the way it settled. Jennifer had chosen well. She always chose well in aesthetic things, which was her profession, and also just her nature. There was nothing cheap or throwaway about what she'd selected. It was the wardrobe equivalent of a serious, well-considered argument. I changed. I won't drag this part out, because the process itself was less interesting than what happened after it. I put on the dress, which fit correctly, which told me that Jennifer had been paying a quality of attention to my physical presence that I hadn't been paying to my own. I put on the flat shoes. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, which is not something I normally do when getting dressed, just sat. Then I stood up and went to the small mirror above the dresser. Ryan Calloway looked back at me. Clearly, unmistakably Ryan Calloway. No one was going to mistake me for anyone else. But Ryan Calloway in a dark teal dress, and the specific quality of what I felt looking at that image was something I need to try to describe precisely because it was not what I expected. I expected awkwardness, self-consciousness, the full body wince of a man outside his context. What I felt instead was something much stranger and much quieter. What I felt was that the background noise in my head, the constant, low-frequency hum of Ryan Calloway managing and monitoring and performing Ryan Calloway, went very slightly down in volume. Like someone had reached for a dial I didn't know was there, and turned it 3 notches to the left. I stood there longer than I needed to. Then I went back out into the main room. Jennifer was sitting in the armchair by the now-cold fireplace, her hair pulled back in a way she never normally wore it, wearing my spare flannel shirt over her own jeans, her version of being Ryan, which was both genuinely funny and somehow perfectly observed. She looked up when I came out and went absolutely still for a second.
"Oh," she said.
Very quietly.
"Don't," I said.
"I'm not doing anything," she said. "I'm just, hi, Riley." I stood there for a moment. The morning light had fully arrived now, warm and clean through the cabin windows. A bird was doing something complicated in the hemlocks outside. My wife was looking at me with an expression that had several different things in it simultaneously: love, recognition, relief, and something that might have been the particular satisfaction of being right about something you've been thinking about for a long time. "Hi," I said. And the weekend began. I'm going to try to tell you what happened in those 48 hours honestly, without dramatizing it into something it wasn't, and without diminishing it into something smaller than it was. Because both of those distortions are available to me, and both would be dishonest. What happened was not a transformation. I did not discover a whole new identity on the first afternoon of wearing a teal dress in a mountain cabin. That's not the kind of thing that actually happens in real life, and I am too analytically minded to pretend otherwise. What happened was a series of small, specific, very real observations about the difference between the way I normally moved through space and the way I moved through it that weekend. We went for a walk in the afternoon, up a trail behind the cabin that followed a stream through a hemlock grove for about 2 miles before opening out onto a rocky overlook. Jennifer wore her usual hiking gear. I wore the cream cardigan over the dress, which ended just below my knees, and the flat shoes, which were fine for the trail. I want you to picture this because it was both slightly absurd and entirely real. A grown man walking through the Blue Ridge Mountains in women's clothes on a Tuesday morning in June, accompanied by his wife, who was wearing his flannel shirt, and neither of them treating it as particularly remarkable. We didn't talk much on the walk. Jennifer had a capacity for comfortable silence that I genuinely envied. I walked and I noticed things. The way you move differently when you're wearing different clothes. Not dramatically, not in a practiced or performed way, but in the small physical language of a body responding to different fabric, different structure, different assumptions. The dress moved when I walked in a way that nothing in my wardrobe moved. It was distracting at first, and then it wasn't. But the larger thing I noticed, the thing I kept circling back to, was that I wasn't monitoring myself. That low-frequency hum, the constant background process of managing Ryan Calloway's presentation, was significantly quieter than usual. I hadn't realized how loud it normally was until it turned down. It was like spending your whole life in a room with a refrigerator running and only noticing the sound when someone finally unplugs it. At the overlook, we sat on a flat rock and looked out over the ridgelines for a long time. A hawk was riding the thermals below us. Actually below us, which always registers as slightly unreal, watching a bird of prey from above. "What are you thinking?" Jennifer asked. "I'm thinking about how loud it normally is," I said. She looked at me sideways. "Loud. In my head. The running commentary. The managing. It's quieter right now." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is that good?" "I think so," I said. "It's strange." "Strange like bad." "Strange like new," I said. "Which I haven't been in a long time." She put her hand on mine on the rock, briefly, in the gesture she always used to say something she didn't need to put into words. We came back down in the late afternoon. Jennifer made tea. We read in the living room for an hour, the fire relit, the mountain evening coming in through the windows in long blue shadows. I kept the dress on because there was no particular reason to change. This was, I recognized, a different kind of choice from the first putting it in. This was choosing to stay and it past the initial experiment, for no reason except that there was no good reason not to. Jennifer looked up from her book once, and caught me looking at the middle distance and said, "Where are you?" "Right here," I said. "You look like you're thinking something large." "Just noticing things," I said. She went back to her book and the fire moved in its contained, deliberate way, and the evening went on. The second day was different in quality from the first. The first day had the particular self-consciousness of any new experience, the awareness of what you're doing, the mental narration of it, the part of your brain standing slightly to one side and reporting on proceedings. The second day, that narration quieted considerably. I got up in the morning and it was genuinely, unremarkably the next thing. I made coffee. I stood on the porch in the mountain air with the mug in both hands. I watched the fog moving through the hemlocks. In the blue midi dress. Because that was what the day was. Jennifer made eggs and we talked about her studio and one of her clients who'd been a source of low-grade frustration for months, and I found myself engaging with the problem differently from how I usually would, less problem-solving mode, less here are the 3 steps, more genuinely curious about the emotional texture of it, asking questions that were interested in what she felt rather than what she should do. She noticed. She commented on it at one point, gently, not making a production of it. "You're listening differently," she said. "Am I? Like you're not waiting for the part where you can fix it." I thought about that. "I'm not in a fixing mood," I said honestly. She smiled over her coffee. In the afternoon, she did something I hadn't anticipated. She set up her sketchbook at the kitchen table and asked if she could draw me. Jennifer drew occasionally, not professionally, just for herself, and was genuinely talented at it, with a particular gift for capturing something true in a person's face rather than just the accurate surface of it. I said yes in the same way I'd been saying yes all weekend, which was the quiet yes of someone who has temporarily stopped building cases. She drew for about 40 minutes. I read my book, or tried to. Mostly I was aware of her watching me with the specific quality of attention that artists bring to something when they're really seeing it. Not the casual look of someone who knows your face, but the detailed, structural, taking you apart to put you back together look of someone studying something they want to understand. When she showed me the drawing, I looked at it for a long time. It was me. Unmistakably me. She'd caught the jaw, the set of the eyes, the particular way I hold my shoulders. But the expression she'd drawn was one I'd never seen in a photograph of myself. Not softer, exactly. More open. Like a door that was usually kept carefully at a specific angle had been left slightly more ajar than usual. "Is that what I look like?" I asked. "That's what you look like today," she said. I put the sketchbook down on the table. Something in my chest was doing a thing I didn't have clean language for, not emotion exactly, or not only emotion. More like recognition. The feeling of seeing yourself accurately, maybe for the first time, and finding that what's there is not what you'd have predicted. Not worse. Not better, particularly. Just real. Actually real, in a way that the version I lived in every day in Cincinnati was not entirely. Jenny, I said. Yeah. How long have you been watching me not be myself? She was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, I fell in love with the version of you that exists when the managing stops. I've been catching glimpses of him for 10 years. Usually in the middle of the night, or when you don't know I'm looking, or when something surprises you fast enough that the reflex doesn't engage. She looked at me steadily. This weekend is the most him I've ever seen. That sentence arrived in a way I hadn't been braced for, because it implied a gap between me and the person she'd fallen in love with that I had not understood was there. I had believed, genuinely believed, that the managed version was the authentic version. That Ryan Calloway, the suit, the presentations, the forward-moving professional machine, that was me. I'd built it from scratch, and I'd built it to last, and I'd been living in it so long I'd stopped being able to see it as a construction. I'm always me, I said. But it came out less certain than I meant it to. I know, she said. But some versions of you have more room than others. We drove home Sunday evening. 3 hours back down the mountain roads and then the interstate and then the familiar grid of Cincinnati streets, the corporate skyline coming into view in the distance. I had changed back into my regular clothes, jeans, a pullover sweater, the ordinary Daniel Koss, the ordinary Ryan costume, before we'd packed the car. Jennifer had given me back her flannel shirt. We had, without discussion, returned to our regular surfaces. It felt appropriate. We'd said what we agreed. This was the mountain. But here's the thing. Here's the real thing, the thing I need you to understand about why I'm telling this story at all. You cannot put something back in a box after you've taken it out. Not everything. Some things, sure, you can have an experience and contain it, file it, return to normal with no lasting turbulence. But some things, once they're out, occupy a space that wasn't there before. Not because they grow or demand attention, but because now you can feel the shape of the space they left behind, and the space is the size of something real. The first week back home, I told myself I was fine. Back at work on Monday, with the usual agenda, the quarterly prep, the emails that had accumulated over the long weekend. I was efficient and focused and performed Ryan Calloway with the practiced ease of a man who had been doing it for 35 years. Nothing to see here. But I noticed things. Small things that I hadn't noticed before. Or rather, that I had noticed and had learned over years not to register. I noticed that I moved through most of my workday in a specific state of low-grade tension, the tension of monitoring. Am I projecting the right image? Is this response showing appropriate decisiveness? Is my effect calibrated correctly for this context? It was constant. It was automatic. And now that I knew what it sounded like when it went quiet, I could hear it. I noticed that in meetings I was primarily thinking about how to be seen rather than what I actually thought. Not all the time, there were moments, the good moments in any job when you get genuinely absorbed in the problem and the performance falls away. But the default was performance. It was a machine I'd been running so long it ran on its own. I noticed that I came home from work on Thursday of that week and stood in the kitchen while Jennifer was cooking dinner and talked about the day in the careful way I always did, the way that selects for the interesting and the competent and edits out the uncertain and the vulnerable, and Jennifer turned from the stove at one point and looked at me and said, quietly, "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said. "You're doing the work voice," she said. I looked at her. "I'm home," I said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm mentioning it." We ate dinner mostly in silence that night, which wasn't unusual, but the quality of the silence was different, the kind that has a question in it that neither person is quite ready to ask directly. I didn't go back to the mountain clothes that first week. Or the second. I told myself this was appropriate. We'd agreed it was a cabin thing, a bounded experiment. It stayed on its side of the line. What I couldn't control was the other thing. The subtler thing. The way the weekend had adjusted something in my internal calibration that could not simply be readjusted when I crossed back into Cincinnati. The way I now caught myself, in the middle of meetings or presentations, noticing the performance from the inside rather than just executing it. The way the managing had a texture I could feel now, like suddenly being able to feel the weight of a coat that had previously been invisible. The breaking point, and I use that phrase carefully because it wasn't actually a breaking, it was more like a seam finally giving way, came 6 weeks after the cabin, in the middle of a presentation. It was the third quarter review. The boardroom on the 14th floor. The 42 people. And I was mid-sentence, mid-slide, mid-performance of Ryan Calloway at his most authoritative, when I caught my reflection in the darkened window behind the screen. This is where I started the story, and here's what I need to tell you about that moment that I didn't tell you at the beginning. It wasn't just a thought. It was a recognition. The reflection in the window was wearing the suit with perfect confidence, gesturing at the slides with practiced precision, projecting exactly the image it had been engineered to project. And somewhere behind it, not visible in the glass, but completely present in my chest, something else was watching. Something that had been to the mountains. Something that had sat on a rock above a hawk and let the monitoring go quiet. Something that answered to a name written on a card in Jennifer's handwriting. I finished the presentation. But something was different after it. Not visibly. I'm certain no one in that room saw anything change. But the gap between the performing and the performed, which I had managed to keep invisible for decades, had opened up just enough for me to stand in it. And standing in it was not the same as closing it back up. I drove home at 6:15 and stood in the hallway with my coat still on, and I thought about it for a full minute before I went to find Jennifer. She was in her studio, the spare room that had been converted into her workspace, canvases stacked against one wall, her drawing table by the window. She turned when I came in. "Hey," she said. "I need to tell you something," I said. She put down what she was holding, gave me her full attention in that way she had. "The cabin didn't stay in the cabin," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "No," she said. "It doesn't usually." I sat down on the stool she kept for clients and guests and looked at her. "When you planned this, the bags, the name on the card, the whole thing, how long had you been building up to it? And, I mean honestly, Jennifer. Not the version that sounds reasonable in retrospect." She sat down on the edge of her drawing table, folding her hands in her lap. "You really want the honest version?" "Always," I said. And I heard, under my own word, the echo of hers from that gallery opening 10 years ago. She was quiet for a moment, deciding something. Then she said, "I've been thinking about this for almost 3 years. Since we started trying for a baby, actually. Because that process requires such emotional honesty, and I watched you during all of it, the hope and the disappointment and the grief of it, and I watched you manage it. Always manage it. Never let it fully through. And I thought about all the other things I'd watched you manage, and I thought about what it must cost over years to manage that much. And then one night I was reading something about identity, just an article, nothing profound. And it said something about how the clothes we choose are one of the most literal ways we perform our social role. And I thought about you and your suits, and I thought about who you are when the suit comes off. And then I started thinking about what would happen if you took a different kind of suit off. A deeper one. Just to see." She paused. "I spent 3 months getting it right because I knew you well enough to know that if a single detail was off, too theatrical, too costume-y, too much like a joke, you dismiss the whole thing and we'd never get back to it. I needed it to be something you could take seriously." I sat with all of that. Outside her studio window, the Cincinnati evening was doing its ordinary thing. "The name," I said. "Riley. A version of Ryan," she said. "Close enough to be yours. Different enough to be something else." "Why did you need it to be something else?" She looked at me for a long moment. "Because Ryan carries a lot of rules. And I wanted to give you something that didn't." I think that was the most accurate thing anyone had ever said to me about myself. Not flattering, accurate. Ryan carries a lot of rules. I had built the rules and lived by the rules and defended the rules and never once seriously asked whether the rules were serving a life or just protecting the performance of it. "What do you want from this?" I asked. "Long term. What does this look like to you?" She thought about it. "I want you to be the person you were at the end of that cabin weekend. Not all the time. I know that's not real. I know Cincinnati isn't the Blue Ridge. I know you have a job and a life and a father's voice in your head that isn't going away. But more often, with less distance between you and what you actually feel." She paused. "The clothes, Riley, that's not the point. That's a door. What's on the other side of the door is what I'm interested in.
A door.
My mother had used that word in a different context years ago, a passing comment that I'd never thought much about. But Jennifer using it now sent something connecting that I felt as a small, clear click.
I need to think, I said. Take your time, she said.
But I need you to know something first, I said. She waited. The thing in the cabin, what you gave me, that was one of the best things anyone has done for me. I don't know yet what to do with it. I don't know where it goes, or how much room it gets, or what it means for everything else. But it was real, and it mattered. Jennifer looked at me with that expression, the one she'd had when she turned from the easel after 40 minutes of drawing me, the one that had several things in it at once, none of them simple.
I know, she said.
I could see it in real time. That's why I waited 3 years to do it. What followed the conversation in the studio was not a dramatic restructuring of my life. I want to be honest about that, because I think the stories we tell about these things have a tendency toward drama, toward the transformative moment that changes everything in a single direction. Real life is messier than that, and the changes that matter most tend to move at the pace of water finding its way through stone, slow, patient, working with the available openings. I talked to a therapist. Not because Jennifer suggested it, she didn't, but because I'm an analytical person and I recognized that the questions I was carrying required more space than I could provide them internally. The therapist was a man in his mid-50s named Dr. Warren Collins, who had a very dry sense of humor and an extraordinary ability to ask the one question that undid the framework you'd spent 20 minutes carefully building. I went every 2 weeks for 6 months. I talked about Frank and the rules and the suit and the mountain and what I'd found when the volume went down. I talked about Jennifer and how she'd seen something in me before I'd seen it in myself, and what it meant to be known like that, and what it meant to have been so thoroughly performing for so long that being known required a specific intervention. Dr. Collins said something in our third session that I've thought about often since. He said, "The work you've done to build yourself has been impressive and costly. The question now isn't whether to tear it down. That would be its own kind of violence, and it wouldn't stick. The question is which parts of the structure are load-bearing and which parts are just habit." I spent a long time thinking about which parts were load-bearing. Jennifer and I talked, really talked, more than we had in years, maybe ever at that depth. She told me things about the 3 years of trying for a baby that she had been protecting me from because she knew I was already at my management limit and she didn't want to add to it. I told her things about my work life that I'd been keeping in the professional compartment, the ways the performance was costing me that I'd been unwilling to acknowledge. We talked about the identity that the cabin weekend had surfaced and what room it got and how and on whose schedule. The mountain clothes were still in the tote bag she'd packed. She hadn't unpacked them or put them away. She left that to me, which was the right instinct. I went through them one evening in early August, 2 months after the cabin, and I kept 2 items. The cream cardigan, which was objectively a beautiful piece of clothing that worked just as well in a different context. And the small handwritten card. Her name is Riley. She likes mountains and coffee and doesn't apologize for taking up space. I put the card in the drawer of my nightstand. By September, I was different in ways that were hard to catalog but entirely real. Jennifer noticed first, then later a colleague at work. Not the surface Ryan, not anything that anyone could have pointed to and named, but something underneath the surface that had adjusted, like a room that's been repainted a shade lighter, where you can't quite say what changed but the quality of being in it is different. The monitoring was still there. I don't want to oversell this. The machinery that Frank built doesn't get dismantled in a summer, and I wouldn't want to dismantle it entirely even if I could, because some of it is actually useful, and some of it is how I operate well in the world.
But there was more space in it now.
More gap between the thing I felt and the decision to perform something different. More moments where the gap closed, and what came out was just what was actually there. In meetings, I started saying things that were honest rather than strategic. Not recklessly. I'm not a person who abandons strategy, but with more of the real underneath the strategy. People responded differently. Not with confusion or alarm, as I might have predicted, but with something that looked a lot like relief. The way people respond when someone else stops performing long enough to just be a person and gives everyone else in the room permission to do the same. Jennifer got pregnant in October. I want to tell you this not as a resolution. It's not a reward. Life doesn't work that way. Things don't happen because you did the emotional work you were supposed to, but because it's what happened, and because the person who was in the room when the test showed positive was different from the person who had stood in that boardroom in July looking at his own reflection in the glass. Different in one specific way that mattered. I was present. Fully present, without the management layer between me and the actual experience. I cried. Not elegantly, not in a controlled and tasteful way. Just actually cried, standing in our bathroom on a Sunday morning while Jennifer watched me, crying the way people do when something they'd stopped letting themselves hope for suddenly is. "Hi," she said after a moment.
"Hi," I said.
"Which one are you right now?" she asked softly. "Ryan or Riley?" I thought about it. Then, "I think I'm both," I said. "I think that might be the whole answer." She came and put her arms around me.
"Yeah," she said.
"I think so too. Here is what I believe, now standing on the other side of that year, and everything in it. I believe that who we are is not a single fixed thing but a territory, and that most of us, through the specific accidents of upbringing and culture and the approval systems we grew up inside, end up camping in a small corner of the territory and calling it the whole map. I had been camping in the Ryan corner for 35 years, very efficiently, with all the best equipment, and it was real, genuinely, authentically real, but it was not the whole map. The cabin weekend was not a costume party. It was not a therapy exercise, although it turned out to function as one. It was my wife, who knew me better than I knew myself, handing me a key to a room I'd locked so long ago I'd forgotten it was there. The room had something in it that was mine, not different from Ryan, not in opposition to Ryan, but underneath Ryan, older than Ryan, the thing that had been there before I started building the performance and would be there after it was gone. The dress was a door. Riley was a name for what was on the other side of it. And what was on the other side was not, in the end, a different person. It was the same person, with less distance between himself and the life he was living. The boardroom on the 14th floor. The navy suit. The presentation. The reflection in the dark glass. I finished the presentation now. Every presentation, every meeting, every performance of competent professional Ryan Calloway, with something I didn't have before. Not a secret. Not a hidden self that contradicts the visible one. Just a knowledge. A small, settled, irreversible knowledge that the man in the suit and the man in the mountain cabin are the same man, and the man is more than either one of them alone. Jennifer's sketch from the cabin is framed on the wall in our study. The one she drew of me on the second afternoon, in the teal dress, with the mountain light coming through the window. It's the most accurate picture anyone has ever taken of me. It hangs next to a photo from our wedding and one from a camping trip a few years back, neither of which look quite as real as the drawing, somehow. The drawing has that particular quality that truth has a little spare, a little uncomfortable, and entirely impossible to argue with. Some evenings, when the day has been long and the management machinery has been running at full capacity and I come home and set down the work bag in the hall, I stop for a moment in the kitchen doorway. Jennifer looks up from whatever she's doing and there's a second of something between us. Recognition, shorthand, the 10 years of knowing someone in every season, and she says simply, "How are you?" Not "How was your day?" Not "What happened?"
"How are you?"
And I tell her the truth. Not the edited version. Not the Ryan-appropriate version with all the performance elements in place. Just whatever is actually there. It sounds like a small thing, but it is the largest thing I know how to do. And I could not do it before the cabin. I could not do it before my wife packed her bags for 4 months and drove me up a mountain and handed me a card with a name on it and gave me 48 hours of being something other than what I'd always been told I was supposed to be. She said it was a fun idea. And she wasn't wrong. There were moments of genuine lightness in it, genuine play, the particular pleasure of two people in a marriage doing something unexpected and finding each other in it. But it was also, underneath the fun, the most serious gift she could have given me. The kind of gift that doesn't have a good occasion and doesn't fit any category and arrives because someone has been paying attention long enough to know what you need before you know how to ask for it. I can't go back. She was right about that too, the night she asked me to say yes before she told me what it was. You can't unsee what you've seen in the mirror when the mirror is finally honest with you. You can't unhear the quiet once you've heard it. You can't return to this small corner of the territory and call it the whole map once you know there's more. But here's the thing about not going back that took me a while to understand. Not going back is not the same as losing where you came from. Ryan Calloway is still here. The suit, the boardroom, the 35 years of built and tested professional identity, it's all still here, still real, still mine. I didn't leave it in the mountains. I just stopped believing it was the only thing. The map is bigger than the corner. That's all. That's the whole revelation. The map is bigger than the corner, and there is room. There has always been room for all of it. And on a Sunday morning sometimes, when the Cincinnati light comes in at a particular angle and the city is still quiet and Jennifer is making coffee in the kitchen, and the house has that specific warmth of a life that is actually, honestly, completely yours, I think about a mountain cabin and a teal dress and a card with a name on it. And I am grateful, in a way that goes deeper than words, for a wife who had a fun idea.